I started there in 1951. Johnny Lennon came the year after. He came in 1952, I think. I'm pretty sure about that. And that was a couple of years later down the line because, yeah, you kick off in that school when you're 11, just getting close to 12 years of age, and then we caught up a couple of years later, must have been 13, I suppose, 13, 14. I'll have to get the school report out to verify these figures. I mean, out the top of my head, I don't know. But we did enjoy the school days, a good laugh a minute. He'd been talking to his closest friend, Mr. Peter Shotton. They had had a discussion, I believe, with somebody else before that. I can't think of the guy's name now. We had that little meeting outside the school woodwork room in the yard. John Lennon, Shotton and myself, about forming this little group. That's how I started, and Eric Griffiths, I think he pitched up as well. And Johnny Lennon wanted to call it something. I said no, I don't fancy that. The Quarrymen, what we must call it. And he didn't want to know, but he didn't put up too much of a moan about it. And the other two, Shotton and Eric, he said, no, that's the best, this Quarrybank High School here. Yeah, the Quarrymen sounds good, so that's what happened.
I'm suspending you both. Your parents and your aunt will get letters in the post. I don't want you near this school for at least a week. I don't even know when I want you back. Questions?
Any chance I can get the magazine back, sir?
The overwhelming consensus, Mrs. Smith, is that John should not return to Quarrybank.
Oh, please, sir. You have to understand. Down deep, he's a good boy. And very talented.
What if I could arrange for him to attend the Liverpool College of Art?
The art college?
Yes, it's a more untraditional setting, less structured. The headmaster there's a friend of mine, and, well, I took the liberty of showing him some of John's drawings.
This is such good news.
What about this famous photograph that's become sort of like world famous now of the 1957?
Oh, the school photograph?
Yeah.
I think we had about 500 pupils in the school in those days.
So on that photograph, you're standing next to Peter Shotton,
Yeah.
who's next to John, who's next to Eddie.
No, Don Beatty was
Don
the one.
Beatty, yes.
Everybody all around was smiling, if not pissing themselves, hosing themselves. And that was why Don Beatty's got his head. He couldn't control it. Yeah.
Because your colours turned up as well on that.
Oh, well, we decided that me, Shotton and Lennon, on the way, walking across to the lawn to get the photo taken, decided, we're going to... Yeah, we're all a bit of rebellious in those days, and I went through with it. I turned the collar up on the sports coat, and I ruffled the hair, but I'd had a crew cut, so it didn't look too much ruffle either. But right near the end, just as we were going to take the photo, Mr. Lennon had to smooth down his hair and put his Slim Jim tie straight and put his best looking imitation Elvis look on. Pete Shotton sticking with his chest.
It's a great picture though, isn't it?
Well, it is. It is a good picture. Much sought after, that one.
Yeah, I bet it is, yeah.
This is Walton Village, and this is St. Peter's Church, which was John Lennon's local church. And this is where John's Aunt Mimi would bring John each Sunday. And John actually got quite involved with all the church goings on. John was in the Sunday school here, he was in the choir, and he was in the Cub Scouts here as well. And every year in Walton, we have an annual festival called the Walton Village Fete, which is a big garden party organised by the church. And it was at one of these Walton Village Fetes where John and Paul first met. This is a copy of the original poster that advertised the day. So it was the Walton Parish Church Garden Fete and the crowning of the Rose Queen. And it took place on Saturday, July the 6th, 1957. And they had all these special events going on. The Liverpool Police Dogs display, fancy dress parade, sideshows and refreshments, the band of the Cheshire Yeomanry, which was the military band. In the evening, there was a grand dance to be held in the church hall, and this was featuring the Quarrymen Skiffle group, which of course was John's group, which was some rock and roll for the young ones. This is St. Peter's Church Hall, and this is where John and Paul first met. They were actually introduced by a mutual friend from Walton, a young man by the name of Ivan Vaughan. He was a good friend of John's and an occasional player at chess bass in the Quarrymen. But Ivan went to the same school as Paul, which was the Liverpool Institute, and Ivan knew Paul, and Ivan had the foresight to think that John and Paul may be good together as musicians, so Ivan invited Paul along this day. He actually introduced Paul to John on the stage steps of the village hall. And after a short audition, John was suitably impressed by this young fella. And he very quickly got word to Paul that he wanted him to join the group. And as John famously said, that was the day that I met Paul, that it started moving. And that's what it says on this plaque, which was unveiled in 1997 by the surviving members of the Quarrymen, who came back to Walton Village for a reunion show, just as they'd done 40 years before. And as part of the celebration, they unveiled this plaque to mark the spot where rock and roll history began, the place where John and Paul first met.
Hello. Pleased to meet you. I'm Kevin, what's your author?
My name is Pino from Italy. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Peter.
And we are talking about the Beatles and the lives and all your story of their life. You have written a book about McCartney's family.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And now Paul McCartney was the first one.
Yeah. And now there is a new George Harrison one about George's family.
Yeah, that was the second one. So it was Paul first, and then it was the George Harrison one, which you've got there in your hand.
Yeah.
The sound of that's the way you got planned.
You found the first piece of artwork, we can call, by Paul. Did you discover?
That's right, yeah. A lot of researchers in other books always relate to an event in Paul's life when he was 10 years old and he wrote an essay for the Queen's coronation. Yeah. It was a school essay and Paul had put his in. And a lot of other researchers and other books always refer to this as a major event. But he never looked into it any further. He just carried on using the same old tag that Paul won a boot open when he was age 10. So I took it upon myself I spoke to Paul and Mike about this, and they told me what the content of the essay was, so I knew what the essay was. And then when I was going through the archives, I decided to go have a look around, see if we kept the essay. And when I went back into all the records, we made a note that we did keep the school essays. So it was a case that I was trying to find out where the essay was kept. After a couple of weeks, I managed to locate where the essay was. Once I'd found the school essay, I phoned Mike McCartney up and said to Mike, we've got Paul's essay in our record office. I said, I'm going to move it now to the strong room so nobody can get at it, but let Paul know. Then about half an hour later, we got a phone call from Paul's company, which is MPL, just congratulating us on finding the essay. And Paul said we can use it in any publicity that we want to use.
And what was Paul thoughts about the book, about his family? And you had a great contribution from the family as well?
That's right. It was like, because Paul's always touring, and you can't get hold of Paul directly, Mike McCartney, Paul's brother, was acting like the middle person. So the way it would work is I'd find information, I'd send it on to Mike. Mike would read through the information, he'd approve it, and then he'd send it on to Paul. And then Paul would approve it, and then it can go into the book then, so that'll be part of one chapter, and then we move on to the next piece of information for the next chapter.
What about George's family? Which connection have you found to collect information on the history, on relatives?
Yeah, it first come about when I was working for the Martin Scorsese film. After the produced, I was more and more involved with the making of the documentary, Living in a Material World. And I did explain to Martin Scorsese's company that I'll be doing a book myself of his family history. So the deal that we did was that Olivia Harrison would do her book first to complement the DVD and documentary. Then once she's done her book, then I'll bring my book out. So from that, I contacted George's sister Louise, who lives in America. She was very helpful with family photographs, her memories as well. But the problem with Louise was there was a 10-year gap between he'd moved from Liverpool over to America. She'd been married and moved. So from there, I got Louise's memories. And then I contacted George's cousin in Ireland, who lives in Dublin. And he also provided me with information and family photographs. And his cousin Audrey, she still lives in Liverpool, she contacted me with her family memories. Then it just evolved from there. From the memories that they was telling me, I was going to look for any record of what they was telling me and finding the records. And then putting the records in the book. Like George's great-grandfather who died in the war, in the First War. Found a photograph of him in the Liverpool newspapers. And the story of his death as well was reported in the newspapers.
Have I read somewhere that George's granddad maybe was a gardener too?
Yeah,
so
that was on.
Could be a connection with.
That was on George's other side, on the French, because they was from Ireland. So it was the French side who came from Ireland, and the Harrisons who came from Birmingham. They was English, and it was Joseph French, who was a gardener for the estate in Crosby, Great Crosby. He was the official gardener, but he died in around about 1891, 1892. But being the head gardener and then looking at George's later life, when George decides to become a head gardener of Friar Park, it's that little connection in the family that George didn't know, that his great-grandfather was also a gardener as well at Great Crosby, on one of the big estates in Merseyside. When I started doing the George documentary and also the George book, not a lot had been written about George, not a lot of research had been going on about George. And what I found was George was really influential in the beginnings of the Beatles, because whereas John and Paul, they was happy to either stay in Forthland Road or in Mendip and write songs together. There's quite a lot of historical photographs where you can see them inside the houses writing songs. George was actually out and about with his guitar. He was jumping in with other groups, jamming with other groups, looking for a gig anyway. And it was George that was instrumental in getting the gig at the Casbah Club. So when the Beatles had broken up after Hamburg, it was George again who was instrumental in getting the Beatles back together, getting John and Paul back together to do another gig. So George, even though he was the quiet one, He was the one who was determined in the early years of the Beatles. And what I found out later was that the media, they only wanted to speak to John and Paul. So George took backseat and let John and Paul take all the interviews, talk about the records, the songs they wrote and stuff like that. So George was happy at that point. He'd achieved what he wanted to achieve in being a guitarist. He wants to be a guitarist most of all in a band. The first 2 records was by George, believe it or not. The first 2 Beatles records was by George. The first one was In Spite of All the Danger, which was he done when he was 15 and 16. That was written by George Harrison and Paul McCartney, who was credited on the record. The second one was in Hamburg, and once again that was credited as George Harrison and John Lennon. So the first 2 recorded singles was George Harrison. So George was credited as the songwriter, not Lennon and McCartney.